talk to us about the War of 1812.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me up here to do this little talk. Just a little background on myself. I'm a transplant to New York myself. I've only lived in the Churchville area since 1967. But they do consider me, try to get away from the speakers. They do consider me a friendly person because I did manage to marry a local girl, so they've accepted me finally. I've actually been a reenactor for approximately 30 years. I fought the Civil War 3 times, twice on the winning side, once on the losing side. At one point though, I finally decided that I really didn't like shooting at Americans. So what I did is with a fellow compatriot of mine from the Genesee Country Village, we started an 1812 militia unit. So now we get to shoot at the Brits instead. Unfortunately, I've been fighting this 3-year war since 2007. We still haven't won yet. But the one thing that, I'm going to tell you what most people know about the War of 1812. The burning of Washington. We've all heard about that. Fort McHenry and the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Battle of New Orleans. That is what 99% of the Americans know about the War of 1812. Most of the fighting occurred in what they referred to as the frontier. And actually, Western New York was the frontier at that time. Actually, some of the bloodiest fighting actually occurred in New York, or on the borders of New York. Everybody thinks about the bigger battles that they know about. Believe it or not, there were only 59 American casualties at the Battle of New Orleans. At the Battle of Lundy's Lane, there were 125 American casualties. So it goes to show you that what we always think is not necessarily true. Now, the War of 1812 actually goes back way before the war actually started. We're going back to 1806. That is when the British started their orders. Let me just get the word here, the orders in council. Now we all know that everybody thinks the war started because we impressed naval sailors. Unfortunately, that's true. They were fighting a war against Napoleon. They needed manpower. It's a whole lot easier to take somebody else that's already trained as a sailor and put them on board a ship. A typical naval, even a frigate, the USS Constitution was a frigate. It carried 400 men. I don't know if anybody have ever seen old Ironsides. It's not really that big of a boat.
There we are.
So in 1806, they were impressing our sailors. They were going on a theory, and remember this theory because I'm going to reference it later on. They go on the theory that once a citizen of the crown, always a citizen of the crown. And they still really didn't accept the fact that they lost the revolution. So they figured they could take any sailor, and they came from the Americas, the colonies as they referred to it. They could use them as they wished. They weren't the only ones though. The French were also doing it. We actually did fight what was known as a quasi-war with France. That only lasted about 6 months. Turned out that our frigates were a whole lot better than the French men of war were. So that continued on for several years. Now in 1809, which I believe is when Parma was formed? Yes, in 1809, James Madison was elected president. He was a Virginian, but he also wanted to avoid any foreign entanglements. So he didn't really push too hard for negating the impressment of the sailors. The only people that really were anxious to fight, to take over other lands, were along the western frontier, the Indiana Territory, the state of Ohio, the Kentucky areas and things like that. So they were known that they were pushing for a war. They wanted to be able to take over the lands that the Native Americans held. The British realized that this gave them a fighting force that they didn't really have to worry about. They encouraged the natives to attack settlers that were in the frontier. So what would happen is they would arm the Brits, the Brits would arm the natives. They would attack the Kentuckians, the Indianians would get mad. They would ask their congressmen to do something about it. They never did anything about it, just argued. Pretty much like they do nowadays. So then this continued on for several years. Now, however, in November, Madison actually started recognizing Napoleon, which kind of pissed off the Brits a little bit. So the British put on an embargo on the American ships and such. So they were actually not only taking sailors, they were taking ships. So naturally, the Americans protested, and in June of 1812, the British rescinded the orders in council. So they no longer officially impressed our sailors and took our ships. They still embargoed us, but in the meantime, the war hawks are drumming the drums of war, and they finally declare war on Great Britain in June of 1812. The very unusual thing about that whole thing is 2 weeks before we declared war, the British rescinded the orders in council. So that was the reason we used to go to war, but they negated that. Now, at the beginning, most of the war was fought aboard on sea. The most famous battle that we all think about is Old Ironsides. I fought against the Guerriere in August 20th of 1812. At that point, it was very, Isaac Hull was the commander of Old Ironsides. The story goes that the British commander of the Guerriere said that their cannonballs bounced off of the sides as if they were iron. There's something to be said about the Georgian white oak that they used to build the ships. Now, in approximately October, well, actually in September, they came up with this glorious plan of three-prong attack on Canada. Because as we all know, the Canadians, they were just waiting for us to come up to Canada and liberate them from the British. At least that's what we kept telling ourselves. One of the things that most Americans didn't realize at that time, and especially in the Niagara Peninsula, was 90% of those people were New Yorkers who were loyalists during the war. So they went there, they did not want to be Americans. So there again, we went into war on another false premise. But they developed this three-prong attack. We were going to attack Montreal up through, across the upstate Adirondacks region. We were going to attack Upper Canada opposite Detroit, and we were going to attack across the Niagara River. Now, in this area, when the war was declared, all of the militia units were called up, and they were sent to the Niagara River to protect against the evil British coming across the river. The company that I reenact, McKay's company out of Caledonia, was one of those. We were the 77th Regiment of the New York State Militia. We were there, we were camping along, having fun. The regulars were slowly coming up to the Niagara Peninsula. The American generals did not want the militia around. Militia typically had a very poor image. This even goes back to General George Washington. His thought on militia was that they were not good to have because they tended to eat all of our supplies, take all of our tents, and run at the first sign of danger. So that's one of the fun impressions that we can do at a reenactment every once in a while as a militia unit. We get tired of playing shooting, we just turn around and run, and we're being perfectly accurate. So the American generals, General Smythe decided that, along with the General Stephen Van Rensselaer, who was the commander of the New York State Militia. He was a major general, he had been commissioned as a major general. He outranked the brigadier general that the U.S. regulars had sent up. He had overall command. He turned over basically the leadership to the regulars anyways. He was a political general, like most of the early generals were. So the middle prong that they were going to use, actually in October, was across the Niagara River at Queenston. Lewiston on this side, Queenston Heights across the river. Most of the American New York militia had been sent home. A few of them did stay, so they had acquired boats to ferry the troops across, but they didn't have enough boats, naturally. So the regulars went across first, and as they were returning with the boats, the wounded were coming back. The Native Americans, the Seneca Indians, the Grand River tribe that were fighting along with the British, whooping and hollering across. The wounded are coming back. Our very good New York State militia all of a sudden realized that their contract said that they were to defend the state of New York, not invade a foreign country. So they refused to go across, which this eventually led to our defeat at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Probably the only good thing that came out of that is that one of the best British generals, General Brock, was killed at that battle. So that was the middle prong. It failed. The northern prong up through along across the St. Lawrence. General Winchester. He was in charge of that. He had a shady past. He was looking back on it, we find out that he was actually a spy for the Spanish down in the Gulf area. He led the troops across the river at what is known as Chrysler's Farm. We managed to get ourselves licked there also. The regulars had not been highly trained at this point. So they were going up against these troops that were fairly well trained, and they were pushed back, and actually that failed also. But probably the most, I will say the most ridiculous loss was the western prong, going across the river at Detroit. General Hull, William Hull, who was the brother of Commodore Isaac Hull. General Hull had marched his troops up to Detroit. He had approximately 5,000 troops between the volunteers from Kentucky and Indiana. The Ohio volunteers were with him, plus some friendly Native Americans, plus he had 3 regiments of regulars. Got to Detroit and was faced off by General Brock and 400 British and Indian troops. They managed to frighten General Hull enough that he surrendered his entire force. So, our beginnings of the war did not go well at all. So that pretty much takes care of the beginning of the war. Some things are going on down south. Some of you may have heard of General Andrew Jackson. Yeah. He probably was one of our better generals that we had, in spite of the fact that he was a militia general. He led his troops down south, and he actually managed to hamper the Cree Indians and the Cherokee Indians and the Creeks that were uprising in that area there, and made a major battle at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which pretty much knocked the sails out of the southern aspect of the Native Americans against us. In the meantime, the British are having fun along the coastlines. They up and down the Atlantic coast, they're shelling cities, villages along the Ontario shore. The British troops are raiding our villages. They're coming ashore taking supplies. In this particular area, I can give you three little ideas of what actually happened. 2 ideas what happened with some of the militia engaging the British. The first one was actually here in the Rochester area at Charlotte. The British knew that the supplies were in Charlotte. They sent 2 boats ashore to pillage the warehouses in Charlotte. The American militia commander saw them, knew that he was outnumbered, but he was stubborn. So what he did was he took his troops, he marched them in full view across the open plain so that the British could see him, snuck around, marched them by again. He did that 4 times. The British thought they were outnumbered and they ran. Now, another one, which is really, I find really funny, is at Sodas Point. The historian out at Sodas Point, Bruce Farrington, actually made a little video about this incident. The British, same thing, they came ashore, they brought 2 boatloads, they had maybe 15 men. Warehouses were right there, so they didn't have to go too far. The American militia, Sodas Point militia, all 20 of them, got their weapons, and there is a slight hill, and they were marching down the hill, heading towards the British. They were going to actually attack the British. They got partway down the hill, one of the militiamen tripped. He didn't have his gun at half cock, and it went off. The militia thought the British were shooting at them. They turned tail and ran up the hill. The British saw that they were outnumbered. They only had 5 Marines with them, so they only had 5 muskets, so they turned tail and ran. So I'll leave it up to you to decide who won that battle. So it goes to show that even then, battles are hinged on the smallest things. Now, by 18, we'll go to, well, in September of 1813, in Lake Erie, we're doing a little bit better in Lake Erie than we are in Lake Ontario. Commodore Perry actually managed to defeat the British at the Battle of Put-in Bay. If you want to get a chance to see what a 1812 ship looked like, if you ever get a chance to go to Erie, Pennsylvania, the ship, the brig Niagara, is there. It's a replica of one of the boats that was at the Battle of Put-in Bay. So, the Navy is still doing good. The USS Wasp defeats the Pebble, HMS Pebble. But it's only single ship actions that they win. On Lake Ontario, it's a completely different idea. The British main fleet is based out of Kingston, Canada, or Upper Canada, as they referred to it. The American fleet was based out of Sackett's Harbor. Both ships had both fleets were approximately 20 ships in size, various size ships. The largest ships typically had, believe it or not, 40 guns. Long guns and carronades. The long guns are good for long firing, the carronades are for close-in fighting. The British actually had one ship that was 60 guns. Both Navy forces were building ships. They actually, at one point, each of them had a ship which had 114 guns. Now, we don't think of the lakes, we think of them as lakes, we don't think of them as seas. 114 guns is considered a ship of the line. So they really were ready, hunting for bear, ready for bear. But both commanders were afraid of losing ships. So they refused to actually come to battle against each other in Lake Ontario. Off of the port of Hamilton, there was actually one battle. They were supporting the American forces that took over Fort George. They spent an entire day literally circling each other, trying to get the weather gauge to be able to win. Not a single shot was fired out of an entire day of maneuvering and firing. So it was completely different between the Blue Water Navy and the Brown Water Navy. Now, in December, go back a little bit. Remember I said a lot of the people in the Niagara Peninsula were transplanted New Yorkers. However, they were somewhat discriminated against by the British that were there. So that a lot of times they were considered second-class citizens. Some of the, I'll call them Canadians, they were very typically, well, they were outlaws, to tell you the truth. They were called the Canadian Volunteers. They aligned themselves with the American forces, but they were out to try and get even for any transgressions against them. They, at one point, the worst thing they did was in December of 1813, they burned the city of Newark, which we now call Niagara-on-the-Lake, which in itself was bad enough, but there were no men other than elderly men and women and children in the village at that time. So at that point, the British naturally were a little upset. Believe it or not, the Americans were upset also. The general that was in charge, General Smythe, the gentleman that didn't want the militia along at Queenston Heights, he was actually cashiered from the army over that. But the British, to get even, what they did is they came across the river and they took Fort Niagara. There were approximately 200 men at Fort Niagara at that time. And the way they got in is they overpowered one of the pickets, got the password, literally went up to the South Sally Gate, knocked on the door, and gave the password. And came inside, and they actually bayoneted 45 wounded and sick American soldiers that were in the hospital there. Just chased the rest of the troops out of there, and then proceeded to move up the river, burning farms, warehouses, and everything as they moved towards Buffalo. They got to Buffalo and the Black Creek area. At that time, Black Creek was a thriving community, was probably 15 houses, 3 taverns. Yeah, they always seem to have a lot of taverns in those days. The village of Buffalo, they had 4 taverns, but both of these areas were considered shipyards. So the British, when they came ashore there, they wanted to take over those areas, control the Niagara River. Well, as they're doing this, the word spread across western New York. And at one point, there was a refugee train 5 miles long heading from Buffalo, Black Creek area towards Batavia. Batavia was the biggest city in the area. Batavia was the major marshalling point for the American forces. The General Blakely out of Ontario County called up 2 regiments and moved towards Black Creek and Buffalo to repel the British. There in what we now call Williamsville, there was a field hospital, mainly sick. Even nowadays, most casualties in war are due to illness. And it was very prevalent at that time. So they are traveling through. We always think of Ridge Road as being a major transportation mode, but actually in 1812, it wasn't as big, it didn't really become the big thing until the bridges were made across the Genesee River. So the major transportation route was what we now call Route 5. The Genesee Turnpike in this area is what it was referred to. Colonel Blakesley was traveling through the village of Caledonia, or Hampton, Southampton they called it at that time. He got to Caledonia, and Captain McKay, he saw them and he asked them where they were going. They told him, he says, we're going up to repel the British into Buffalo. And he says, can we go? Apparently he hadn't been in the service long enough to know you never volunteer. At that point, General Brown in Leroy said that McKay's company were good, stout Scotsmen and a welcome addition to your force. They did. They traveled with them. They got to the Williamsville, Black Creek area, and the British at this point were making a major push inland after burning the actual villages of Buffalo and Black Creek. At this point, this is where I always like to say, McKay's company, our claim to fame is we got captured. And the reason I say that is you have to stand still long enough be captured. And according to my own family history, one of my ancestors was with Streeter's Company, which was out of the town of Riga at that time, now the town of Chilai. They had already been up there. And according to my relative, he overheard Captain McKay telling Captain Streeter, "You fall back, we'll meet at the pub for a drink afterwards." And that was actually the last that was seen of Captain McKay and 10 of the members of McKay's company until the end of the war. They were at this point captured. Now remember I said they were from Caledonia, primarily a Scotch group. Hearing that Scottish brogue, naturally the British thought that, remember I said, once a citizen of the Crown, always a citizen of the Crown? They were captured, marched in December to Montreal. We don't really hear what happened to them in Montreal because none of them will ever speak of it. If they did speak of it, nobody wrote it down. It's one of the bad parts about studying the War of 1812. There is very, very little written documentation. So eventually things are starting to go better for the Americans. In 1814, we decide that we're going to go back across the river, and we attack Fort Erie. We do actually manage to capture Fort Erie, and from there we travel north along the river, heading towards Fort George to capture that. At the Battle of Chippewa Creek, this is the first time when the American regulars actually stood toe-to-toe with British regulars and won. Scott's 1st Brigade was at the head of that. There were 3 regiments there. All 3 of the regiments, because General Scott believed in uniformity of his troops, he figured if everybody looks good, they're going to fight good. He didn't have enough blue wool, so he clothed all of his men in gray fatigue coats. Now, typically at that time, militia wore gray, regulars wore blue or red. The British thought they were going up against militia, and they turned out to be 3 highly trained American regiments. They beat back the British. After both sides licked their wounds, the Americans continued north to what we now call Niagara Falls, Canada. Lundy's Lane. The British had set up a line there, and this was one of the few times when there was actually a night battle during